about that later on. But I also want to talk, first up, we're going to hear about the Environmental Protection Agency, which in October approved the use of phosphogypsum in road construction. It's a waste product of phosphate mining. It contains small amounts of radioactive isotopes of radium and uranium. And on Friday, a coalition of public health, environmental, and union groups sued the EPA for approving phosphogypsum in roads. And that's what we're going to talk about first here. Let me give out the telephone number in case you want to join the conversation, 813-239-9663. You can email dj@wmnf.org or text 813-433-0885. One of the groups that's suing the EPA is the Center for Biological Diversity, and their Florida director and senior attorney, Jaclyn Lopez, is joining us now by Zoom. Welcome back to WMNF's Midpoint Monday, Jaclyn.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you can join us. So let's start with, first of all, what is phosphogypsum?
Phosphogypsum is the radioactive waste that is created when phosphate ore, which is mined here in Florida, gets turned into phosphoric acid, which is predominantly used for fertilizer. So it's the product, well, it's not really a product, but it is the outcome of applying the sulfuric acid to the phosphoric, the phosphate ore that gets mined. And the result is this radioactive waste that is then stored in piles, principally because the radioactive waste puts off radon, and the EPA has determined that the best thing we can do once we have this waste is to keep it concentrated in the stacks and try to mitigate the radon that off gases from them.
So far, you've used words like stacks and piles, but to people who live in the Tampa Bay area, they kind of look like giant mountains. So where is this phosphate waste stored, and what's its ties to the phosphate industry?
Thanks for pointing out how potentially misleading stack and pile can be. Really, they are mountains. They're hundreds of acres wide and hundreds of feet tall. And in fact, I grew up in the Tampa area, and there's the Riverview Gyp Stack, for example, which is right off of US 41, right there on the west side of the road. Well, actually, there's one on the west side and the east side now. And if you didn't know better, you'd think maybe it was a municipal landfill, because all you can see from the road is just this giant berm that goes up. From the air, it's much more impressive to see these towering stacks. The connection to the fertilizer industry is that the majority of the phosphate that is mined, at least in Florida, goes toward creating phosphoric acid, which is used in fertilizer. So the majority of the mining that we see in Florida, which is mostly in the interior of Polk County, Hillsborough, Hardee, down south to DeSoto, all of that, or the majority of that, goes to these fertilizer plants, which are next to the phosphogypsum stack. So the one at US 41, there's a few others. There's the New Wales Gyp Stack. Actually, throughout Florida, we have about 25 stacks that store about 1 billion tons of this radioactive waste. And once the phosphate that's mined gets processed and taken to the fertilizer plant where the sulfuric acid is applied, the waste is kept on site virtually in these stacks. And so we have the legacy of the fertilizer industry here with us in Florida. Florida has the densest concentration of this waste, but we're not the only state. Louisiana has a stack, and in fact, the stack at St. James Parish made the news about a year or so ago because it was actually moving. It was sliding, and a nearby farmer noticed that. And the state environmental protection agency there was scrambling to figure out what to do with this, because they're very heavy, they're very large, and when there's a problem, it's a significant problem for the community around them. There's also stacks in North Carolina, Mississippi, and further out west, but by far Florida has the most of them.
We're speaking with Jaclyn Lopez, who is with the Center for Biological Diversity. She's their Florida director and senior attorney. And speaking of these stacks in Florida, one of the ones that you mentioned was in New Wales. People will remember that from four or so years ago, when a giant sinkhole formed at the top of this stack, and all of the water, or almost all of the water that was being stored in that stack, drained probably down into our drinking water aquifer. So what else should people know about that if they barely remember that story, or if maybe they haven't heard of that story? What should people know about that accident?
Yeah, that was in September of 2016. And one of the more alarming things was that the sinkhole happened inside of this gyp stack, and the public didn't learn about it for, I think it was almost 2 weeks. So there was a significant lag between the company that owns it, the government that regulates it, and then the public that lives nearby was notified. Another thing that we learned after that sinkhole was through an open records request that there had been several other similar incidents just in that one phosphogypsum stack. So perhaps that's an indication that that particular stack has issues, or perhaps that other gypsum stacks might be similarly vulnerable. There was another sinkhole, I think it was in 1994, at a phosphogypsum stack further north in Florida. So that would seem to suggest that the idea of storing that volume of acidic radioactive waste can be problematic when we have like our limestone base and the potential for that erosion, that sinkhole action to then enter, as you mentioned, the aquifer or the well water down below.
Our guest is Jaclyn Lopez, Center for Biological Diversity. Their Florida Director and Senior Attorney, Jaclyn Lopez, is joining us here on WMNF's MidPoint Monday. It's 12:12 in the afternoon, and you're listening to 88.5 FM. My name is Seán Kinane. You were talking about the waste. This liquid waste is radioactive. So, what makes it radioactive? Why would there? I mean, we don't think of this byproduct from Florida soil as being radioactive. So, what makes it radioactive?
Along with the phosphate ore, which is the target of the mining, there's uranium, there's radium 226. And so there's polonium, there's other things that have radioactive properties that are naturally occurring and found in the ground. When the phosphate itself is mined and then processed, some of that radioactive, those radioactive elements are bound up in that process. And my understanding is that in the process of creating the phosphoric acid and applying that sulfuric acid, it makes the radioactive properties even that much more, it enhances the risk of those radioactive properties. Now, once it's stored in its solid form and begins to break down, that's when it releases the radon and becomes a clean air issue or a pollutant exposure issue through the air. And that has to do with the most recent litigation that we filed, why that comes under the Environmental Protection Agency's purview as monitoring or requiring these mitigation measures to address hazardous air pollutants. So actually our phosphogypsum is stored and regulated that way because of the breakdown of the radium 226 principally and the radon that it emits.
And so just to remind people, in October, the Environmental Protection Agency approved the use of this phosphogypsum in road construction. And that's, as we've been talking about, a waste product of the phosphate mining. It contains radioactive isotopes of things like radium and uranium. But on Friday, a coalition of public health, environmental, and union groups sued the EPA for approving phosphogypsum in roads. Your group, the Center for Biological Diversity, is one of the groups that's suing the EPA. What has the EPA's expert consultant said about the cancer risks, for example, to people who are constructing these roads, about the genetic dangers or cancer risks of using phosphogypsum in road construction?
The EPA has long regarded phosphogypsum to present an unreasonable risk to public health. It has done that through a series of rulemakings beginning in the late 80s and early 90s, and found that in building roads that folks that are engaged in that activity can be exposed to levels of radiation that fall outside the acceptable range. And that hasn't changed. In fact, when the EPA most recently reviewed this issue again and hired its expert consultants, those consultants made the similar findings. This still presents an unacceptable risk to public health. And the risk is in the form of fatal cancer. And then, you kind of work backwards from there, other forms of cancer, genetic damage, potential birth deformities. And the only thing that appears to be different in the EPA's calculus this time is the EPA has determined that it's comfortable with this level of risk now.
And this rule change by the EPA that you're talking about, it affects Florida in particular. It's not like we're going to see roads built necessarily in New Jersey or in Vermont, but that could happen in Florida. Why is that?
When the Fertilizer Institute, which is the group that requested this use, made its application, it said that it would only be economically feasible to use phosphogypsum as an amendment to road construction within 200 miles of a phosphogypsum stack. So if you look at Florida and where our phosphogypsum stacks are, and then you add on a 200-mile radius buffer to that, it covers the entire state. Likewise, Louisiana, Mississippi, and some areas out west will be similarly impacted. Although I would say that the biggest difference between Florida and those other states is that, I guess as a consequence of our own geography, I'm not entirely sure, our gypsum stacks seem to be more radioactive than other gypsum stacks located outside of Florida.
Our guest is Jaclyn Lopez with the Center for Biological Diversity. She's their Florida Director, Senior Attorney. The Center for Biological Diversity is one of the groups that's suing the EPA because they approved phosphogypsum in road construction. And your groups are saying that it, not in addition to road people who are constructing the roads, the workers, it also might affect plants, animals, and their critical habitats. How would having radioactive phosphogypsum in the roads affect plants and animals?
Through the sedimentation and runoff are big concerns we have with having phosphogypsum in roads. Roads naturally on their own, absent any kind of catastrophe, break down just by being weathered, by being used. And as that material loosens and finds its way into our surface streams and groundwater, it has the potential for bioaccumulating up the food chain. So when the Fertilizer Institute made its application and the EPA hired a consultant to look at some of these exposure pathways, it looked at crayfish in particular and was alarmed by the potential for bioaccumulation in crayfish and anything that might eat crayfish, including people. There are about 450 or so endangered and threatened species that are within 200 miles of phosphogypsum stacks. When the federal government does anything, it spends money, it authorizes a permit, or it makes a decision, it has an obligation, it's required to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service for impacts to listed species, to determine whether or not there's going to be an impact on them, to see how these species that have already been determined to be very close to extinction might be pushed further to that edge. And here the EPA has failed to do that. So one of the issues that we are concerned with is the potential for the radioactive properties. And it's actually, I should say, it's not just that they're radioactive. They have significant amounts of sulfur, arsenic, barium, cadmium, chromium, copper, fluoride, lead, and zinc. So heavy metals and other trace metals that have demonstrated impacts, negative impacts to human health and to species in the environment at large.
The fertilizer, the phosphate industry has to store this waste. And if it seems like, I mean, it would be a great way to get rid of your waste if you can sell it to companies that are making roads. Is that something that concerns you, that it's just kind of a way to almost hide where the waste is going rather than keep close tabs on it?
I think that is a concern of the EPA itself. When the EPA first determined it was necessary to keep phosphogypsum in stacks, it noted that because there's so much phosphogypsum being created and because it has such a high risk to people and the environment, that the best thing to do is to at least keep it in stacks so we know where it is, so that when there are sinkholes or other breaches, that there is a company directly responsible and hopefully financially resilient to take care of that, to attempt to mitigate it, and specifically found that it would not be wise to scatter it throughout the United States as it has done so here. And notably, one of the groups that petitioned with us is a group that some of its members live less than a mile from a phosphogypsum stack in Louisiana. And the folks that live near that phosphogypsum stack say, well, we don't like living next to a phosphogypsum stack, but we certainly don't want it under our feet and expanding out through our state as well.
Our guest is Jaclyn Lopez with the Center for Biological Diversity. She's their Florida director and senior attorney, and they're one of the groups in a coalition of public health, environmental, and union groups who are suing the EPA for approving the use of phosphogypsum in roads. And you're listening to 88.5 FM WMNF Tampa. It's 12:21 in the afternoon. My name is Seán Kinane. You're listening to MidPoint Monday. If you'd like to call in, you can call at 813-239-9663. You can also email us dj@wmnf.org. You can text 813-433-0885. And I'm going to go to a phone call right now, Jaclyn, if you don't mind. And this person, Chris, is calling from Clearwater, and he wants to ask about radioactive waste. Chris, hi, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for the great show. The underlying point is government does not care for the health of our life or any life, it seems, and these kinds of actions. And of course, I'd like to see folks realize that the phosphate mined fertilizer is obsolete. Most crops need just three minerals, P, N, K, potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus, to grow, to look good, but then their immunity suffers, so then they have that as a lame excuse to use pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. It's called forced growth. And in order to make folks aware that phosphate mined fertilizer is obsolete, and I'll get on to talking about mitigating the radioactive waste with lasers. But
wrap it up really quickly, Chris, please.
Yeah, use ionized water because it's the mineral ions that you can just use like I have an at-home mineral water ionizer to ionize the minerals from Himalayan salt and Epsom salt, which is magnesium sulfate, sprayed on the plants. They do much better. They can fend off the pests. They grow much bigger. Bumper crops, annuals and biennials turn into perennials, and have much better luck. And I've seen cannabis and other farmers using.
So, Chris, I'm going to cut you off there because I want to continue with our guest, but maybe Chris is leading us into a question about the necessity of phosphate fertilizer. Jaclyn, maybe you can address that. The phosphate industry certainly says it's necessary. It helps sells it to farmers, that is, around the world to create very healthy and vibrant crops. What's an alternative to using phosphate fertilizers?
I see a lot of parallels between the fertilizer industry and the oil and gas industry in this moment in time. And that is to say that 150 years ago, we had society, we had functioning society, we had people, we had jobs, everything without massively produced fertilizer, without extreme dependence on oil and gas. And we are coming to the end of the era for both, not just because that's what people are demanding, although that is true, and not just because of the extreme environmental consequences as we're seeing, but also because they're finite resources. Oil and gas are finite, phosphate is finite. And so we had better be considering alternatives to conventional fertilizer as we know it right now, because it won't be around much longer, maybe a few more generations. And so the alternatives, everybody of course is aware of organic and how scalable that is. And I guess I would just push back on the idea that it's first of all, that it is necessary. We have demonstrated history that it's not necessary, or that it's our obligation to find another way for the fertilizer industry to be successful, but those pathways exist.
And before I let you go, is there anything else that people need to know about upcoming meetings about phosphate mining in Florida? Are there any counties that are currently considering it? What should our listeners know about phosphate in Florida?
There's one phosphate mine that is moving through an approval process up in Union and Bradford counties. So if you live up north or you have concerns up there, that's one to look out for. It's a smaller mine relative to the ones we have in West Central Florida. The other one is the big one that's down in DeSoto County, where the DeSoto County commissioners had originally decided to not approve that, and then through mediation and threat of litigation, decided to change their mind and give 4 years. So the clock is running on that, and I think there's about 2 years left. So we can expect to see public meetings and hearings coming up and considering that renewed application for I forget now if it's about 18,000 acre mine in DeSoto County.
Well, Jaclyn, thank you so much for coming with us, coming on the show today and talking about your lawsuit against the EPA for allowing the use of radioactive phosphogypsum in road construction. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's Jaclyn Lopez, Florida Director and Senior Attorney for the Center for Biological Diversity. And you're listening to WMNF 88.5 FM. And it's 12:26 in the afternoon. We're going to take a very short music break.